All right, so yesterday we were looking at converting percents to decimals and percents to fractions. So we saw a few different ways that we can do that, and we got a lot of practice. So today we're kind of going backwards. So we're going to be looking at how to convert decimals to percents and how to convert fractions to percents. And it's still pretty easy. It's got a few maybe extra steps for some types of problems, but I think if you were good with yesterday's problems, those types of problems we were working out, I think you'll be in good shape for what we're doing today. All right, so just looking at these three representations of numbers, we know that 1/2, 0.5, and 50% are all telling us the same thing, yes? So 1/2 is telling us we're looking at a half of something. 0.5 is also telling us we're looking at half of something, and 50% tells us we're looking at half. They're just written in different ways. So 1/2 is obviously a fraction. 0.5 is a decimal. And 50% is a percent. Okay, so we can represent the same value in multiple ways. We looked at that yesterday. Okay, so we're going to practice converting. We're going to start off with writing decimals as percents. I'm going to be writing decimals as percents. So if you were to be given a problem, it would tell you the directions would be write each decimal as a percent. So you'll be given a decimal and they want you to change it into a percent. It'll be the same value, the same amount, but it'll be written in a different way. Kind of like when we were looking at writing ratios in different ways. It was the same thing, but it was written differently. All right, so there's a couple different methods that we can use to write decimals as percents. One of them is using place value. And I'll show you what I mean when we get into this example. Okay, so if we're looking at the decimal 0.3, the first thing that we can do to write this as a percent is first write the decimal as a fraction. Okay, so the first thing we do is write the decimal as a fraction. How would I write 0.3 as a fraction?
Move the note.
3 over 10, right? Because if we read this decimal, we read it how? 3/10. So that's exactly how we write it as a fraction, 3 over 10. Are we good so far? Okay, so that's our first step. And then the second step we need to do, and I'll give you a minute to write this down. You're going to write an equivalent fraction. You're going to write an equivalent fraction with 100 as the denominator. Okay, you're going to write an equivalent fraction with 100 as the denominator. Okay, we know how to write equivalent fractions, yes? Okay, so in order to write an equivalent fraction, I've got to start with my original fraction, 3 over 10, and it tells me that I want an equivalent fraction with 100 as the denominator. Okay, so how do I figure out what's going to go in the numerator? Say that again.
Multiply that we use it to the denominator.
Yeah, so what did we multiply by?
10.
Yeah, we multiplied by 10. So we're going to do the same thing on the top. And what do we get for the numerator?
30.
We'll get 30. Okay, but we're not quite done yet because the directions told us to write it as a percent. So we've written it as a fraction, but we're still not quite finished. We still got to write it as a percent. And y'all, this last step is really easy. All you have to do is write the numerator with a percent symbol. Like that's really all. You write the numerator with a percent symbol. So what's my numerator? 30. And then I add a percent symbol. And do we agree that 30 over 100 is equal to 30%? Yeah, we looked at that yesterday. We would change the 30% to a fraction. Okay, so that's basically what we just showed, that 0.3 is equal to 30%. Okay, so we write it as a fraction, which was 3 over 10. We write an equivalent fraction with 100 as the denominator, and we got 30 over 100. And then all we have to do is write the numerator with a percent symbol, which was 30%. How are we feeling about that so far? Good? All right, let's look at another example. Okay? We've got 0.43. What was the first step that we did on the last one? Write the decimal as a fraction. Good. Okay, so how would I write this decimal as a fraction? 43 over 100. Because how would I read that decimal? 43 hundredths. So if I want to write it as a fraction, I would write 43 over 100. Now, the second step in the last one was to do what?
Write the numerator with the percent symbol.
That was the last step.
Write an equivalent fraction with 100 as the denominator.
Yeah, so the second step was to write an equivalent fraction with 100 as the denominator, but we already have a fraction with 100 as the denominator, so we don't have to do that step. So now all we have to do is exactly what James said, which was to write the numerator with a percent symbol. Okay, so what's my numerator? 43, and then I just add a percent symbol. And that's it. So we just showed that 0.43 equals 43%. So it's really easy when we have a 2-digit decimal because it falls in the hundreds place. So we automatically know to write it as a fraction over 100. So those are especially easy. Okay, so that's one way to do that, to convert a decimal to percent. You write it as a fraction and write the numerator with a percent. That's basically the gist of it. All right, so we're going to look at another method. And this one is probably what I would prefer and what's easiest for me. So in this one, what we're doing is we're multiplying the decimal by 100. Okay, so let's look at an example. If we were given 0.7431 and we want to multiply by 100, essentially all we're going to do is move the decimal. Do you remember yesterday when we were changing a percent to a decimal? What did we have to do? If we were given 43% and we wanted to change that to a decimal, What was one way that we did that?
Move it times four.
We moved the decimal 2 times to the left, or what were we doing when we did that? What was the other way I showed you?
Dividing.
We divided by 100, right?
Yeah.
So today, if we want to multiply by 100 to change this decimal to a percent, which way are we going to move the decimal? We're going to move it to the right 2 places. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because if we divide, we move it to the left. So if we multiply, we're going to move it to the right. So we're going to multiply by 100. So I'm going to write 0.7431. And I'm just going to move this decimal over twice. And that would give me 74.31. And then all you have to do is add the percent symbol. Okay, so it's going to be 74.31%. And that's it. Very, very easy. Now, just like I showed you how dividing by 100 works yesterday, I'm going to show you how multiplying by 100 also works, just moving the decimal over. So if I take 0.7431 and multiply it times 100, we talked about last week or maybe the week before that if we multiply all these by 0, we're just going to get 0, and if we did it again, it would be the same thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of skip over those zeros, but I still have to put them in there as my placeholders, right? Okay, so now I can just go through and multiply everything times 1. And then the last thing I have to do is remember to add that decimal point back in. And in order to do that, I have to see how many numbers are behind the decimal. And it looks like there's 4. So I'm going to start at the end, and I'm going to move it 1, 2, 3. Whoops, I skipped one. 1, 2, 3, 4. And it would go in between the 4 and the 3. And I get 74.31%. So that works too. I really like using this just move it over 2 times method. I think it's really easy and fast. So I would suggest doing that. So let's look at one more. So we know the first thing we're going to do is multiply 100, essentially just move the decimal over twice. So we have 0.023. And if I move the decimal over, I'm going to get 2.3. And then we know I just add the percent symbol. So I'm going to have 2.3%. And that's all you do. So how confident do we feel about converting decimals to percents? Good. All right, so like I said at the beginning, the other thing we're going to do is look at how to convert fractions to percents. Okay? And we are already pretty close to being done. Okay, so in this next example, we're going to be writing fractions as percents. So like in the last one, the directions would tell you to write each decimal as a percent. In this one, we're going to be writing each fraction as a percent. And I think you'll find that as we compare writing a decimal as a percent and a fraction as a percent, you overlap with a lot of the steps that you take to do one or the other. So really, if you can do one, it's pretty likely that you'll be able to do the other. I think between the two, writing decimals as percents is a little bit easier, because with fractions, you just sometimes have to take some extra steps, but I still don't think it's very difficult. All right, so the first method, which is similar to what we looked at the beginning, was that we can write an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100, sorry. Okay? You can write an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100. So the first example, let's say we want to write 4/5 as a percent. Well, rather, you could use your calculator. You could say 4 divided by 5 and move the decimal, but we want to do it using a fraction. So I want a denominator of 100. So what do I multiply by 5 to get 100? 20. And I know I have to do the same thing on the top. And what's 4 times 20? 80. And what do I do now? Add the percent symbol to what? The numerator. So 80 is my numerator, and I just add the percent symbol. So I get 80%. And like when I was grading your homework checks, that's what I would have to do, because I only had 5 questions, but I put your grade out of 100. So in order to decide how many points you got, like if you got 4 out of 5, I would have to multiply times 20, so I would know you got an 80. So that's a very practical application of writing percents, or writing fractions as percents. Grading is probably the most practical way I use that. I will probably give them back either tomorrow or Friday. I haven't put them in the grade book yet. Alright, so then the second method you can use is using division to write the fraction as a decimal. So this is kind of a two-step method that we have to use. Okay, so if we start with 3/8, we can divide to change this fraction to a decimal. Because if we wanted to write an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100, 8 doesn't go into 100 evenly, does it? No, so that wouldn't really work. So in this case, division is going to be our best bet. So I'm going to do 3 divided by 8. Okay, can 8 go into 3?
No.
No, so I need to add a decimal. We looked at this yesterday. Add a 0. How many times can 8 go into 30?
3.
3 times. 8 times 3 equals what?
4.
24. 30 minus 24
6.
is 6. And we need to add another 0. How many times does 8 go into 60?
7.
What is 8 times 7? 56. And 60 minus 56 gives me what?
4.
4. And we've got to add one more 0. How many times does 8 go into 40? 5. Good. 8 times 5 is 40, and we subtract and have no remainder. Okay, so 3/8 written as a decimal is what? 0.375. Okay? But we want to write it as a percent. So when we were looking at writing decimals to percents, what could we do?
Just put the percent next to it.
Um,
Move the decimal.
We've got to move the decimal. Right. So how many times do I move the decimal?
2.
In which direction?
To the left.
To the right, because we are multiplying by 100. So I should get 37.5. And then, Michaela, what do I do?
Then you
Add the percent. So for this one, you kind of had to do 2 steps. You had to change it to a decimal first, and then you could change the decimal to a percent. But we know how to do that, so it's really not any extra work. All right, are there any questions about changing decimals to percents or changing fractions to percents? Are we feeling good? Yes? All right, so when we come back, we will do some example problems for classwork. Sit down, sit down. Haven't told you to go anywhere. When we come back, we'll do some example problems, and hopefully I will let you get started on your homework. If you thought this was pretty simple, then you shouldn't have any problems with your homework. So that'll be our plan when we come back.